This is the wreck of Mary Rose, 390 men trapped and drowned in Henry VIII's greatest warship. She lay at the bottom of the English Channel for 437 years before divers brought her back to the surface in 1982.
The Mary Rose, probably overloaded with men and equipment, had dropped to the bottom like a stone.
Inside her hull, they found 179 sets of human remains. Most of them were young men, some of them still at their posts when the ship went down. Gunners curled near their cannons, archers holding their bows. They also found exactly what caused these men to drown, and it's not what you might think. 415 men sailed out of Portsmouth Harbour on the morning of July the 19th, 1545. 390 did not come home. My name's Joe, and this Buried Earth video is definitely worth your time. So, 1545, Henry VIII is on the throne of England, and he's at war with France again. The Mary Rose was the pride of his navy, the flagship, the most powerful warship in England. She'd been built in Portsmouth in 1510. Henry was barely 20 years old when he ordered her built. He named her after his sister, Mary Tudor. For 34 years, she served him. She fought the French at sea, she sank the French flagship in 1512, and she was rebuilt in 1536 to carry more guns and to fire from her side. That rebuild is going to matter later. It's a part of what would get blamed for what happened in this story. Henry loved this ship. By the summer of 1545, she was his prized possession, and on July 19th that year, he stood on a castle wall on the south coast of England to watch her go into battle. Standing next to him on that castle wall was Lady Mary Carew. Her husband, Vice Admiral Sir George Carew, was on board the Mary Rose. He was commanding her that day. Henry was about to watch his greatest warship roll over and die. Lady Mary was about to watch her husband drown. But what did Mary Rose actually look like? She was huge for her time, 600 tons, about 45 meters long, with 4 masts. She carried 91 heavy guns, bronze cannons, iron guns that loaded from the back. The whole upper deck was designed to fire in single coordinated blasts at an enemy ship. She was new for the time. Most ships before her couldn't do this. She also carried smaller weapons, hundreds of them, pikes, swords, and 172 longbows with about 2,000 arrows. The men who could draw a full-length warbow were specialists. They had been training since they were children. By the time that they joined the Navy, their bones had literally been shaped by the bow. Above all of this though, across the entire upper deck, there was anti-boarding netting. It was thick rope mesh tied tight to the rails of the ship. It stretched the entire length of the upper deck. It existed because boarding was how naval battles ended in 1545. Enemy soldiers would jump from their ship to yours and fight hand-to-hand combat on your decks. The net was meant to stop them getting on board. But what nobody actually thought about was what would the net actually do if the ship rolled over. About 415 men were on board the Mary Rose on the morning of July the 19th, 1545. The commander was Vice Admiral Sir George Carew, and he was a personal friend of the king. His wife was on shore that day, about to watch him die. The captain was a man called John Clare, an experienced naval officer, and among the archers was a young man whose name we're not quite sure of, but he is the most famous man on the ship now. Nearly 500 years later, we call him the Archer Royal. His bones tell us he was about 20 to 25 years old when he died, 1.79 meters tall. His spine was bent from a lifetime of pulling heavy warbows since childhood, and his bow fingers had grooves worn into them from the bowstring. He carried a sword, he wore a leather wrist guard with royal badges on it. And here's the surprise. Tests on his teeth and bones show he didn't grow up in England. He grew up somewhere in North Africa. He wasn't the only one as well. Modern science would later show that the crew of the Mary Rose was far more international than anyone in Tudor England had ever bothered to write down. We'll come back to him later in our story. July the 19th, 1545. The French had sent a massive invasion fleet to attack the south coast of England. Around 200 ships, more than the Spanish Armada that would come along 40 years later. They arrived in the Solent, that's the stretch of water between the south coast of England and the Isle of Wight, right outside the city of Portsmouth. Fun fact, I was born in Portsmouth. Anyway, Henry VIII was at Portsmouth. He had been inspecting his fleet over the previous days. He moved up to the South Sea Castle that morning to watch the battle from the walls. The English fleet sailed out to engage. The Mary Rose was among the lead ships. She was firing as she manoeuvred. The lower gun ports, the ones that were cut into the side of the ship to let the cannons fire outwards, were open. That was normal. You couldn't fire if they were closed. But those lower gun ports were also pretty close to the waterline. Maybe too close. The rebuild in 1536 had added more weight and more guns. Most historians think that the rebuild had made the ship less stable than she had been originally. That day, the water was calm. There was light winds, but the water was clear. Then something happened. Eyewitnesses on the shore said sudden gusts of wind happened. They hit the ship while she was turning. One contemporary report described it as being like a flash of lightning. A sudden fierce blast of wind came out of absolutely nowhere because the skies were clear. The Mary Rose heeled hard to her starboard side. That's the right hand side if you're standing on the ship facing forward. She tilted further than she should have. Further than she could recover from. The lower gun ports on the starboard side dipped under the surface of the water and the sea came pouring in. So the water came through the gun ports. Tons of it. Within seconds, the ship was leaning further and further over. Below the decks, 400 men felt the floor tilt underneath them. The gunners were at their cannons on the starboard side, the side that was now going underwater. The cannons themselves were heavy, thousands of pounds each, and they started to slide. Some of them broke loose. They crashed across the deck and smashed into the opposite wall. Anybody in their way would have been absolutely crushed. The soldiers on the upper deck tried to scramble to high ground. The deck was now nearly vertical. Above them was the netting, and that netting did exactly what nobody had ever thought about. It held everybody inside. The men that were trying to climb up the rolling hull hit the rope mesh and could not get through. The men trying to jump clear ran into it from the other side. There was no way out. The Mary Rose finished her roll and went over. Within moments, the upper deck was underwater. The net still stretched across all of it. The men that survived the cannon collapse and made it to the deck were now trapped beneath this netting. The ones who could swim found themselves clawing at rope mesh that they couldn't break through. Below them, the lower decks, the men were still alive in the pockets of air as the ship sank deeper, but they had nowhere to go. The hatches above them were sealed by the net from the outside. The water was rising fast. The Mary Rose hit the bottom of the Solent in less than 5 minutes. Henry VIII was watching all of this from South Sea Castle. The reports at the time say that he could hear the screams of his men in the water. Lady Mary Carew was standing right next to him. She saw her husband's ship roll over and then disappear. The other ships in the English fleet rushed to that spot. They pulled men out of the water for as long as they could, but only about 25 men were saved. About 390 men died inside of the entire ship of Mary Rose, most of them in the first 5 minutes of its sinking. The battle kept going though. The French eventually withdrew without landing on English soil at all, but the Mary Rose was gone. Henry VIII never recovered from the loss. I guess he really liked that ship. It was the most expensive ship on his fleet. His friend Carew was dead. Eyewitnesses said the king was visibly shaken when the ship went down. He had been laughing and joking with his officers just minutes before. After she sank, he went quiet. Lady Mary Carew is recorded as crying out the name of her husband as she watched the ship roll. The king stood next to her. He could do nothing. The English version says that it was an accident and that it was a freak gust of wind, but the French claimed that they had sunk her with their cannons, but no English source ever supported that version. One quote that survives, attributed to the Flemish sailor rescued from the water, said Carew had complained on board that he had men that could not rule. Some have read that as a Tudor-era cover-up, blaming the crew for failing to close the gun ports in time. Others think it was an excuse meant to protect the ship's reputation, but we don't really know. Whatever the truth, attempts to raise her began almost immediately. The Tudors tried for weeks to drag her back to the surface with ropes and barges, but they kept failing. They recovered a few of her guns, they got some of the rigging out, but they left almost everything else behind. The men inside her stayed where they died, and then she was forgotten about. So for nearly 300 years, she lay in the mud, forgotten by everybody except the fishermen whose nets occasionally snagged on her timbers. In 1836, two brothers, John and Charles Dean, were professional divers working in the Solent. Their nets caught on something. They went down to see what it was. They found the wreckage. They didn't know it was the Mary Rose at first. Over the next few years, they recovered some cannons and some longbows, but then they ran out of money. The site was then once again forgotten. Nearly a century and a half passed. In 1965, a historian called Alexander McKee began searching for the Mary Rose. He used sonar equipment that could pick up metal on the seabed. On May 1st, 1971, a diver named Percy Ackland swam down through the silt and found the timbers of the ship. They had her. The Mary Rose Trust was formed in 1979 to manage the recovery. Prince Charles became the patron, and the team began the most ambitious underwater archaeology project in British history. Over a decade, 28,000 individual dives were made on the wreck site. Archaeologists worked in cold, dark water with absolutely no visibility. They mapped the hull and recovered artifacts. Then they made a decision that had never been tried before. They were going to raise the entire ship. The plan was insane. The hull of the Mary Rose was almost 500 years old. Half of it was missing. It was destroyed over centuries of currents and marine life. The other half had only survived because the mud of the Solent had buried it in oxygen-free silt. Take it out of the mud and into the air, and it could crumble. The engineers built a custom steel cradle around the hull underwater. Then they brought in a barge with a massive crane mounted on top of it. The crane lowered its hook into the water and divers attached the lifting frame underneath. Then the crane began to pull. The hull broke free from the mud and it started rising towards the surface. The Mary Rose broke the surface of the Solent for the first time since 1545. The hull was lowered onto the barge and taken into Portsmouth Dockyard, the exact same dockyard where Henry VIII had ordered her to be built in 1510. 179 sets of human remains were found in the wreck. That's far fewer than the men who died. The other bodies had been lost to currents and time over the centuries. The skeletons were almost all young men, late teens, 20s, a few in their 30s. The oldest was about 40 years old. And what they could tell about how the men died was almost as bad as just knowing that they did die. Most of the skeletons showed no battle wounds. They hadn't been killed by cannon fire or weapons. They had drowned, or they were crushed by their own weapons when the ship rolled. Some of them were found still at their posts, gunners curled up near their cannons that they had been firing, archers near piles of arrows. And one of the skeletons recovered from the wreck wasn't even human. The archaeologists found the bones of a small dog near the carpenter's cabin, a young terrier about 18 months old. He was probably kept on board to catch rats. They named him Hatch after the sliding door that he was found next to. Just like the rest of the crew, he had nowhere to go when the ship rolled. And then there was the Archer Royal that we spoke very early in this video about. The young man whose bones had been shaped by a lifetime of pulling warbows, his spine bent, his fingers grooved. Modern forensic scientists rebuilt his face from his skull. You can see him in the Mary Rose Museum today. His tooth enamel was tested for stable isotopes. The chemical signature locked into his bones in childhood. Different parts of the world have different signatures. His signature was North African. He had grown up somewhere in North Africa, possibly modern Morocco or Algeria, before joining the Tudor Navy and becoming an elite archer. The Archer Royal wasn't the only one. Scientists tested bones of 8 different crew members. 5 of them had grown up in Britain, the other 3 grown up somewhere else. For nearly 500 years, the Mary Rose has been treated as a story about English sailors and English archers and an English king. The actual men on board this ship had come from all over the world though. Tudor records don't describe them in this way because the Tudor world didn't bother to write it down. The clerks who recorded the crew listed them by trade, an archer, a gunner, a sailor, a carpenter, not by where they had come from. So modern science has done what Tudor record keepers didn't bother to do. It had given the dead their identities back. And now, almost 5 centuries later, we can finally know all of this. Which brings us to the question that has been haunting historians for nearly 500 years. Why did the ship actually sink? Number 1, the gust of wind theory. A sudden gust of wind hitting the ship at the completely wrong moment when she was already turning around. The lower gun ports flooded. Most modern historians accept this as the main trigger. But then we've got number 2, the overloading theory. The 1536 rebuild had added way too many guns and added way too much weight to the ship. She was top heavy. The wind only just finished off what a bad design started. Then we've got number 3, the gun port design theory. The lower gun ports cut during the rebuild were positioned dangerously low. Some computer models now suggest that they were almost certain to flood when the boat turned on a certain heel. Number 4, the crew theory. The Flemish sailors' complaint about the crew not having men that could rule. Crew error. Communication breakdown. Number 5, the French theory. French cannon fire damaged the ship. A granite cannonball was actually found on board the wreck. But the English never accepted this version, and the ball may have just come from English shores. Most current scholars think it was a combination of the first 3, strong winds, poor stability, and low gun ports. Crew error possibly just making things a little bit worse. But here's the thing. Nearly 500 years later, after the wreck has been raised, after 19,000 artifacts have been catalogued, and 170 skeletons studied with the most advanced science we have, we still don't know the answer for certain. The Mary Rose is in a museum in Portsmouth right now. You can walk past her hull. You can stand just a few meters from the same timbers that Henry VIII watched roll over in 1545. You can see that the cannons had crushed the gunners. You can see that they slid across the deck. You can see the Archer Royal. His skeleton is in a case, his reconstructed face just nearby. We will probably never know exactly why the Mary Rose sank, but we've got a pretty good idea. Henry VIII lost his greatest warship in 5 minutes on July the 19th, 1545. It took us nearly 500 years to get the crew back.